Now, or?
It is better now,
Okay,
yes.
Great. Let me try without headphones. Yeah. Hi, Diana.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Do you hear the fan?
Yeah.
I can't,
Okay, good.
but I do have a leaf blower outside drowning out any of that stuff. Great. Thanks for joining, everyone. I wonder if we can get started just with personal introductions.
Elaine, before we get started with Diana on, I am getting a little bit of like feedback or a muffled sound. And so Diana, I don't know if it's helpful for you to mute when you're not talking.
Yeah, good call. Yeah, we can all mute when we're not speaking. Good morning, everyone. Just a heads up for the four of us here, the session wraps up around 12:15, so we can all sort of be mindful of that in the conversation. But maybe we could start with introducing ourselves. I'm happy to start. Maybe we can just go around Sam, Ja, Diana. I'm Elaine Minji Limmer. I am a planner working out of Boston. I grew up in Southern California in the suburb of Cerritos outside of LA. My family moved to California when I was around 6 from Korea. And I worked for a few years as a community organizer, sort of like movement building capacity for anti-child trafficking related initiatives out of New Haven, and am now in Boston. I sort of fell into planning as a super holistic way of trying to address the vulnerabilities related to trafficking, and have now sort of expanded that to addressing other vulnerabilities that communities face, and still see planning as a really kind of powerful way to address that. Sam?
Yeah, hi everybody, it's good to be connected here. I'm Sam. I'm the Assistant Director of Business Development and Economy Initiatives at the Mary Thompson's team here in New York City. My pronouns are he, him. I come from California and come to this work after being a community organizer. Sorry, Joe, I can't hear you.
Hard time hearing you, and so I was saying maybe if Elaine could mute, and then if you could get a little bit closer to your mic, that would be helpful.
Yeah, for sure.
Perfect.
Is this better?
Yes, so much better.
Yeah, I come from California after doing some community organizing work, mostly working with Black and Asian youth, and found my way to urban planning after understanding that lack of economic opportunity and all of the violence that entails would be exacerbated by climate change. And so studied at the intersection of climate change, adaptation, and economic development, and have landed here in New York City to do that work within the apparatus of the municipal government. And I think for those for whom it matters, I'm an Aquarius with a Pisces rising and a Libra moon. I'll pass it on to Ja.
Excellent, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Jadi Williams, and I'm currently a senior associate at Mass Design Group based out of our Boston office. My work focuses primarily, I think anything and everything I do is about space making. However, I'm able to make space for those who historically have not had space intentionally made for and around them. That's how I choose to focus my work. And so prior to coming to Mass, I was at Sasaki Associates, which is how I met both Diana and Elaine here on the call, and got my undergraduate degree at Northeastern here in Boston, and my Master's of Architecture from University of Pennsylvania, or Penn Design, or I know our school just also changed names as well, but y'all know what I'm talking about. So just generally very interested in how design and architecture could serve and should be servicing better marginalized communities, and interested in how I, as someone uniquely positioned to be in industry can really begin to broaden the conversation. At this moment, I'm focused primarily at Mass on our Public Memorial and Memories Lab, and so I'm working primarily across projects that deal with spatializing memory across the country, and I can talk a little bit more about those specific projects as we get into the conversation.
Thanks, Ja. I'm Diana Fernandez, and I'm a landscape architect and associate with Sasaki, and that's where I met Jadi and Elaine. It's really wonderful to join you guys here today. I sort of venture from the island of the Dominican Republic. This is, you know, I identify as an Afro-Latina myself. My roots are very much sort of rooted in the history of this island, which is really centered around being really the home of the Taínos, and also the start of the transatlantic slave trade here in the Americas. So there's just sort of a lot built into my heritage and where I come from, and a lot of work I've done to sort of uncover that. In addition to that, I think I've spent the majority of my life trying to sort of find my identity. You know, moving from the Dominican Republic to New York City as my first place was just incredible and overwhelming at the same time. And then finding my way into design was even more perplexing. So I feel like landscape architecture found me. I went to Temple University, Temple grad, go Owls. And, you know, I really have focused my practice around really designing for underrepresented groups that often don't have a voice. And particularly now my research, I just completed a fellowship with the Landscape Architecture Foundation focused on landscape heterogeneity as a design process, which really focuses on celebrating difference, both within ecological and anthropological systems within our public realm. So in short, I think, you know, all of those words are super sort of heady, but you know, I feel like it's my life's work to create public spaces that feel a lot like what I grew up with, spaces that weren't designed by landscape architects and that embrace both often the traumas of this place and also the beauty and resilience within our communities.
Thanks, everyone. I also wanted to start off with a big thank you for all the organizers of the Hindsight conference. Sort of starting from the initial call for applications and all of the materials along the way have really communicated just a desire to create a space where we can talk really freely and not have to code switch or think of other ways of framing things. But I feel like you've all created a space where I feel like we can all just sort of bring our full selves and have this conversation. So much appreciated for that. Just to give like a broad overview, this is, you know, we won't have slides or anything. This is meant to just be a very open conversation, and I encourage everyone to also participate in the chat. You know, bring up your own questions, give your answers to the questions that we're asking each other. And sort of the broad impetus and theme for this is to talk about, you know, how we bring our whole selves, our, you know, biases, baggage, anxieties, joys, background into our practice and ways that we face resistance to that and how we might be able to better incorporate that into our practice. So we'll start off with a couple questions around sort of diving into how our experience as BIPOC designers and planners really differ, and then go into some questions about the ways that we practice, and then close, you know, with some hope and talk about what's giving us life these days. With everything that's going on. So maybe we can go ahead and dive in. I do want to direct this first question to Diana, given all of your work and thinking around heterogeneity and your general love of difference and celebrating that with people. And, you know, talking about what are the ways that we feel like we sort of face resistance to pluralism in design and planning. I think oftentimes there's this sort of myth of an objective analysis that'll get us to the right answer, where planners and designers are seen as kind of service providers that are getting to some sort of ultimate and absolute strategic decision that already exists out there, rather than discovering difference and holding all of those different perspectives together. So yeah, curious to hear from you, Diana, first, and everyone jump in, please, on, what are the ways we've been asked to sort of erase difference as practitioners, and what might it look like to resist that?
That question is like relevant to everything my research is about, and I think what I stand for as a human. And it's, I want to start off with the first myth, and I kind of want to call it out, and that is that design is universal and that everybody is welcomed. Particularly when we say we're designing within the public realm, we're creating a space for everybody, and everybody should be welcome there. And that is like the furthest thing from the truth. Particularly here in the United States, this is a context in which property, right, and who was deemed property themselves is directly related to our creation of space and place, right? And we can't dissolve those two things. This is not a this is something that I viscerally sort of like feel, because when I am in different spaces, growing up in the hood, I didn't have access to the same public spaces that my neighbors did. And when you tell me I'm welcomed in Whitestone when I was living in Corona, I mean, come on, let's back the truck up here. There was no way in hell I was going to be welcome there. That space wasn't designed for me. The intentions in creating that space weren't designed for me. And often this revolves particularly around the design doctrine that is based on utopias, this sort of like perfect society. And when you think about utopias as a sort of central concept to design, they're about a singular identity, right? So when we come into these communities and we're like, hey, we're going to design this park and it's going to be great for everybody, and we're listening to you guys, we're doing engagement. And then all of a sudden we draw this like big circular thing and we're like, hey guys, look, you're all here. And it's like, wait a second, everybody had to give up their identities for this singular vision. And I think that is the true disservice here, is that we are not creating the space within design, right, to allow for that difference, to allow for that pluralism to actually be enacted in the physical design, that it's actually visceral, and I think it requires re-education, it requires unlearning within the design doctrine, and really the shift away from centralized power structures, because a lot of this is about maintaining the status quo. It's about, in America particularly, about white power over BIPOC communities. And it's so important for us to dismantle that and to call out the bullshit, because it's not universal. It's not welcoming for all. And when I should have the right to, as a designer, to say, I'm designing a Black landscape, I'm designing a Latinx landscape, and you may or may not feel comfortable in it. And that's cool. Because at the end of the day, it's those differences enacted in the public realm that allow us to be a democracy, right? That allow us to be like empathetic towards differences. And if we try to sort of whitewash everything and create this sort of, singular identity, this utopian ideal, we are inherently moving away from the thing that allows us to be resilient, which is those sort of heterogeneic principles or characteristics that define us.
If there's anything else that needs to be said to that. I know you said for like us to jump in and answer, but I think Diana covered it. The only other thing I would add to that is, especially now, I feel like in 2020, with all that's going on, I'm getting a sense that we as designers are kind of not setting ourselves up for failure, but we are moving in a way as if design can really solve all the problems. And I know we know that's not true, but I've found myself in some rooms and some conversations where the conversation is so hopeful, and it is perhaps boastful, and we're just taking on so much, not fully understanding how much so many other realms and aspects play into the work that we're doing. So like, as we talk about, the design is but one part of this larger conversation. As we talk about the systems that are in place in these public spaces, there's entire industries that also need to be adapted and adjusted and brought up to speed in terms of these conversations. So when we talk about education, we talk about access to resources, as we talk about just general dispositions of society towards other people. Like, we could design a Black or Latinx space all day long, but if the surrounding community has not been brought into a conversation that allows them to explore how quite frankly, discrimination and historically harm has been done in these public spaces, then our work is but half complete, right? And so I think the other thing that we need to be asking ourselves as designers is like, how are we doing the social work that is necessary to support the design work that we ultimately look to achieve it? And I realize, you know, at some point that's not our role, but at some point maybe it is. And for too long, we've ignored the fact that that's also part of our role.
Go ahead, Diana.
I'm sorry. Can I just jump in real quick? Josh said something that is so important here, because I think we have to remember that these communities have often been told that they are not capable of defining design excellence for themselves, right? That you're not capable, you're not good enough in all of these contexts. So there's no way in hell we're going to go in here and say like, oh, we're going to design something that's of you. And that community needs that space to heal. To your point, Jadi, we need to sort of work in the social standpoint, right? To ensure that we're sort of trying to break down those oppressive barriers and that understanding, right? That you're not good enough, right? To allow us to get to that space of imagination, right? Because we can't get there without making room for that.
Yeah, I feel like there's this trend of like within the of planning, there's sort of an idea that as a designer, that has to be like your salient identity and how you interact with the community, and that the community is sort of like a recipient of like the planning process and how restricting that is. And I'm curious to talk a little bit more about just like carrying ourselves into every conversation. Like I go into conversations with communities as a planner, but I also walk in as a woman and as an Asian American, and those things are like immediately obvious and color how I think about things and how I make other people feel comfortable or not. And I am curious to hear more from you, Ja, on this, based on all your work, you know, related to memory and sort of specifically thinking about how we walk into communities and work and the different ways that we might relate to like the pain and trauma that we're also witnessing in the communities, and how that differs from, you know, our white colleagues and how we carry that as practitioners.
Such a loaded question. In the work that I'm doing, and I think this should be the case across the board, but particularly for the work that I'm doing, and I'll just, before I explain this, I'll caveat and give people a better understanding of Mass Design Group as an organization for those that might not be familiar. So we're a nonprofit design collective, and we have an office in Boston, which is the one that I'm based out of. We have teams in Kigali, Rwanda, Poughkeepsie, New York, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and a few others scattered around. And as a nonprofit organization, we're really able to prioritize who we work with and what we work on. And so we align our projects with partners who are also mission aligned organizations. And what I value about that and what I really appreciate that is that automatically sets a tone of vulnerability and empathy that I had not yet previously experienced in architecture and design. Coming to Mass, I was quite honestly on my way out, and the only thing that was keeping me in this profession was the fact that I understood how blessed and privileged I was to be a Black woman in architecture, and I realized that someone somewhere needed to see me here, so I was staying for that reason, which we all know is not a good reason. That's not a self-serving enough reason. But coming to Mass, I was able to kind of step a little bit into my humanity, if you will. And again, I go back to empathy and vulnerability. And so fully carrying pain into project discussions, first of all, I'm a very vocal person. You know exactly how I'm feeling, how I'm doing, because I need you to see me as a person before you see me as anything else, right? Like, yes, Elaine, you were saying when you walk into a room, there are a lot of things that are obvious about you, but there's also a lot of things that are not immediately obvious about you. And I want folks to be able to see that about me, because yes, I am a designer. Yes, I'm coming to this table with architectural experience and knowledge and et cetera, but I'm also somebody's daughter, right? Like I'm also somebody's sister. I'm about to be somebody's wife. I am an artist. I like to laugh. Elmo is my favorite character. Like all these other things that bring me to a place where I feel like we can have a conversation person to person that allows us to better relate to one another, so that then we can do this work through design, right? And so I'm comfortable now, more so than I ever was, bringing my pain points, but also bringing my joy points into project discussions, because I feel like that's really the only way that we're going to actually do this work. If I come in closed off, very hyper professional, very straight to the point, very, this is what we need to accomplish, this is what we're going to set out to do, we're not actually having a conversation at that point. We're not actually exchanging anything. There's no opportunity for knowledge sharing. There's no opportunity for emotional connect, which is where the work, the project will actually result from. Instead, we're just checking boxes. We're just moving through a process. And that's the ways in which I feel like design has been a disservice to us for so long, is that it's just been such a process, and not necessarily and don't get me wrong, there's another way in which I'll probably use the word process throughout this conversation. So it will sound like I'm contradicting myself, and I am not intending to by any means, but I think it's about really removing the emotion from our work that has resulted in some places that, and some experiences that have not really served the communities that they aimed to serve. As it relates to, our white counterparts, it's hard sometimes, because on one hand, I never want to talk about a group of people as a group of people, especially because I don't like it when people do that to me. It doesn't help us. I mean, it goes back to the point that Diana was making earlier, right? Like, we cannot continue to do that, because that is really how we harm ourselves and each other in this work that we're doing. But I do find, especially here now in 2020, as we're working through the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, and as we're working through what it means for various communities to be disproportionately affected by COVID, I find myself in much more pain at these project tables than what my white counterparts appear to be going through. And I realize that I don't know their story. I realize that I don't know what's going on, but I'm sitting in project meetings crying. I'm sitting in project meetings demanding that we shift the conversation, that we talk about our project and our work in a slightly different way. I'm asking what else can we be doing right now? And I feel like that's because of who I am and where I'm from. That's because I'm thinking about my families. That's because I grew up in the heart of Boston, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, where we're looking at the drastic differences in numbers compared to where maybe some of my white counterparts are living and are coming from. And so I think I don't want to suggest that it's a lack of empathy on their part, but I think it's perhaps like a lack of vulnerability that they're either willing to step into or have been forced to navigate through in their lives. And I personally find mine to be a skill set that I wish everybody had, because I feel like it gives me an opportunity to see more and hear more than they ever could. But at the same time, it's a labor, because here I am at this table having and needing to have a very different conversation than they're having and needing to have. And also, as I step into the public, right? Like, if we're talking about a project, there's the design table where you're with your colleagues and your peers, and then there's the room where you're with your community colleagues and peers. And when I step into those rooms, everybody's looking at me because I am the Black woman in the room, because I'm expected to be vulnerable, because I'm expected to be empathetic, because I'm supposed to be able to understand where they're coming from, because I'm of this neighborhood, I'm of this community. And so I definitely feel like I should get paid double for the work that I'm doing. If I'm being honest, because it's constantly navigating from so many different perspectives with so many different skill sets and tool sets, sometimes that I don't even know I'm tapping into until 2 weeks later, when I'm reflecting back on something that happened or a conversation that took place, or ways in which I had to, like, on the spot, educate somebody about something. And it is a labor. It is a labor of love, and it's necessary, right? Because how else are we going to change the conversations? How else are we going to impact the work that we're doing? But it's challenging. It's challenging. And I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's how I'm feeling. So that's going to be the answer for now.
I feel like I've been thinking recently about just the pace we have this unspoken assumption that like no matter what's happening, like the show must go on. Like it's incredible
Yes.
to me that for the last like 8-9 months we've somehow kept going. And what does it look like to, you know, like we like talk about designing for a human scale, but how do we create processes that move at like a human pace, like acknowledge limitations that we have, and even like our own compassion and ability to understand new factors and new things that are happening and be able to incorporate that meaningfully into whatever the work at hand is. I'm interested to hear more from you, Sam, on how you carry all of this into your work. I know you work a lot in thinking about just transitions and actually like with a very specific goal of moving away from fossil fuels and addressing climate change. So curious to hear how this plays out in your world. Oh, I think you froze.
I to locate myself within the apparatus of the municipal government here in New York City. And sorry, am I okay now, or?
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm back. Okay, got it. Yeah, I just wanted to start by locating myself within the municipal apparatus here in New York City, and just speak to the fact that although we have a representative democracy purportedly, that structure of governance actually is in a lot of ways direct contradiction to community ownership and the cultivation of community power. And so when we think about what it takes to, you know, move our society away from fossil fuels to a just transition, everything about how we govern, how we use natural resources, and how we relate to each other has to fundamentally shift. I am drawn to the unique levers and potential that the government has, and I think there's been some conceptual frameworks that I want to talk about that has helped me to move and navigate the apparatus, and then some tactical strategies on what that might look like to really work towards enhancing community involvement and community power. So I think for the first one, it's about harm reduction. I think after wrestling with you know, what my role really entails, I think I've just come to the conclusion that we have to wield the government in part to reduce harm. And this comes after really being engaged in work of mutual aid. And I think Dean Spade in particular has really articulated the need for working outside of state-sponsored systems in order to meet our immediate needs, right? And for those of you who don't know, mutual aid is defined by Dean as just a collective coordination to meet each other's needs, usually from an awareness that the systems we have in place are not going to meet them, in service of building transformative social justice movements. And so he really came to this analysis and motivation to put forth mutual aid as a concrete solution to cultivate community power by deeply understanding the ways in which the state has actually entrenched inequalities, has found to exacerbate poverty, particularly through poor relief programs, and exposes communities of color to factors that lead to premature death, actually. And so this is done through a lot of ways in which we still continue to enact as a government, whether that is through reinforcing and creating eligibility requirements for certain social services that punish communities based on racialized and gender difference, that in turn create false hierarchies of the deserving poor, pitting good communities versus others. And this also looks like co-optation, right? It's like, you know, I think the most effective mutual aid program was the Black Panther Party's Free Breakfast Program, which was later adopted by the USAID. But those are provisional, right? Those are given at the whim of the government, can be taken at any point in time, and actually works to redistribute wealth upwards to companies or nonprofit formations that are usually governed by white men, right? That all works to centralize power within government that really doesn't serve communities, right? And I think right now, during COVID, we're really seeing the basic provision of support as being inadequate, right, through the state. And so I think what I can do through just transition work is really in part to reduce harm. I think that is on one side of the equation. I think the other thing that I'm thinking about too is just what role does the government have in terms of becoming an activist formation again. I think since the 1980s, there's just been this perception of government as really, on the economic side, like just fixing market failures, getting out of the way, leveling playing fields for all peoples, and de-risking the market. And there really has been kind of an evacuation of agency, I would say, from city employees, really to be like, we actually can't intervene here, particularly when it comes to like climate change stuff. Like, we just need to let the market figure it out. And as we know, the market is actually what has in large part gotten into us into the climate crisis, right? And then on the social side, like the decades of neoliberal divestment from a basic social safety net, education, and the institutions of voter enfranchisement has really like gutted our capacity from the local, state, and federal level to affirmatively further equity, right? And even with the fair housing law that got repealed, like we're seeing this kind of lack of agency that the government has to really do some good here. And I think my question has been, if we are reducing harm in part, like what is actually the potential of the government though? Like what would having universal free healthcare do for social justice movements if everybody didn't have to worry about, getting harmed, right? And then having to pay for it at the hospital? And what would, having a robust government response to climate change do for the very survival of our species? So I think there is a case to be made, right, for a new type of governance that is more accountable to and affirmatively advances social justice movements. I mean, I think I'm taking great inspiration here from like AOC, Bernie Sanders, Ilhan Omar's of the world, right? And so I think it's all to invite a conceptualization of the government as like empowered in service of communities. And I think lastly, the framework of abolition and divest and reinvest as put forth by Black Lives Matter has been like a real inspiration for me too. And really trying to see like what role the government has in advancing abolitionist endeavors. And so I think tactically in my role here, I oftentimes just ask myself, like, how do I, in my role, create an abolitionist economy that will accelerate a just transition away from fossil fuel systems for the sake of our communities and planets? And for me, like very tactically, for me, it's about like embodied leadership. I think a lot of folks within city government don't stand up for the right things when it gets hard. So I think, personally trying to do that in spaces is difficult. And I'll speak later to how I do that on like the healing tip, but I think that's been something that's been a strategy that I've leaned into. I think education has been really important as well. It's surprising at the senior leadership level how many folks believe that communities, as Elaine, you were kind of pointing to before, that they're devoid of agency, they're passive receptacles of like paternalistic state-sponsored care, but really they're the ones with all the knowledge and can really contribute to robust solutions that meet their needs, right? So I think doing that education to reconceptualize community empowerment and just transition and market principles is like a key tactical thing that I've been doing. And then I think like the third thing that I'll say is that like at every step of the way in government processes, there's a way in which we need to include community voice, even in their absence, so that we can really empower them, like, and create enduring infrastructure for communities to garner more power, whether that's through RFPs, different contracts, pilot programs, procurement apparatuses, what have you. I think that has also been something that I've really taken to heart, and I'll pause there.
I'm curious to hear like a little bit more about your personal experience of like this idea of like being in but not of the system, or if like resistance from within the system is possible, and how we wrestle with that. And same for you, John, Diana. I mean, the three of us work in the capacity of consultants, but I think I've been really reflecting on this question of like almost like a burden or responsibility of carrying like specialized training and knowledge that we have as people who are educated as planners and designers, and how that almost, does it go against like this idea of trying to like democratize design and planning, planning decision making, and how do we sort of like work through that on our own. Something that I've been realizing recently is I haven't even been in practice that long, but I found myself saying things like, oh, well, we would typically do this. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to be like making decisions about like anything that's sort of like a typical or like falling into some kind of pattern. And I feel like I'm sort of inheriting the patterns that like this firm that I'm at or like the education that I received have identified for me. So yeah, curious to hear from you all on sort of like that question of like working with the like decision-making powers that exist, but also how do you hold on to like a sense of like core values and how we might even be going against like the systems we're working in.
Brief here, and I'll start an answer and then I'll pause and think more. But I think one of the ways in which we're kind of challenging a system, at least through the work that we're doing at Mass, is actually the nonprofit structure. Because in doing so, we're able to work with organizations and entities that typically would not either A, have the opportunity to work with architects and designers so early on in their design process, or B, work with them at all. And so I feel like in a way we're starting to begin to undermine the systems that historically have serviced architecture to this like place of elitism, right? Like this is not about who can afford architecture. This is about who needs architecture, who needs design. And we all know that the answer to that question is everybody. And so what I have found in the past 2.5 years that I've been here, in all the projects that I've worked on, none of our project partners have ever worked with an architect before. They've never worked with a planner. They've never worked with a landscape architect. They've never gone down to City Hall to apply for X, Y, and Z permit. Like this process, this experience is so foreign to them. And we take the time, especially I take the time to slow down and say, no, I'm going to share with you this information so that you walk away from this process both with whatever project it is that you needed, but also with a new skill set, with a new sense of information, so that the next time you go into this process, because this won't be your last, right? Like you're gonna have other built projects, you're gonna have other ways in which you're impacting the built environment to do the work that you're doing crucial to your organization. But the next time you go into this, you will be more informed, you will be stronger, you will be better, but more importantly, you can then go share this experience with somebody else. And I feel like that knowledge sharing and that deployment of resources and of information is one way in which we can start to begin to undermine some of these typical systems that, you know, in one aspect, I can't deny that we're probably all complicit in, but in another, you know, that we ultimately are looking to change.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you're saying, John. I think, you know, for me, I think there's this question particularly about, you know, do you burn it to the ground, right? Do you burn the institution to the ground, or do you infiltrate and try to blow it up? Or is there something in between, right? And I always find myself kind of teetering all of these, right? It's like some days I want to blow it up. Some days I'm like totally cool with just like getting by, right? So I think it's important to acknowledge, I think that struggle as a practitioner. I think for me, where I have found my power in this struggle is to understand that when we want to burn it to the ground, we have to understand that it's my communities, the communities I deeply care about, that are going to burn first. And I'm not okay with that, you know, and I know what that trauma is like, so I refuse to continue to enact it. And I think there are other ways to be thoughtful and careful, right, about how it is that we enact change. And for me, it's about bringing myself unfiltered, right, to my practice. And it took me so many years to get there, right, to try to find myself within this profession and then come to the realization that I just wasn't, right, and that I just needed to just do what I wanted to carry myself and my perspective, my lived experience, right, into the design realm. And I think that in and of itself has sort of allowed me to contribute to a practice where, you know, I've worked at smaller firms. I worked, you know, in Philadelphia for many years, and then, you know, here in Boston with Sasaki. And we have to understand that these larger firms are going to continue to work on these projects that have massive impacts on community. And I truly believe, at least, that Sasaki as a firm believes in that future, that Hideo, who was a Japanese American who was interned in a camp, had hopes for this firm that were really rooted on the celebration of difference, of contributing to the built realm with this lived perspective. And that is what I'm trying to enact within my practice at Sasaki, is to have that sort of come through, that I'm not trying to pretend to be anybody else. Like, I'm Diana from the hood, that's Dominican, that like totally cares about communities of color. And the minute you want to tokenize me for all of those things, I'm here to prove to you that I'm something completely different, and that what I have to contribute to the public realm is valuable. And, that's the way I'm moving through, is finding those firms. And right now that's Sasaki, where I can enact that. I can actually realize that within my projects.
Yeah, I think I want to speak quickly to like the dismantle as we build framework, and that is something that I really take to heart from critical resistance. And I think we have the imperative to do both, right? And I think I've been trying to figure out like tactical strategies for doing both, but I think conceptually what has helped me is on the dismantle side, Ray's dad in Star Wars was captured by the Empire because of his ability to create the architecture and the plan for what would later become the Death Star, right? He, though, was like socially justice-minded and built within the designs of that built form a way to destroy it. So I think there is a way in which I conceptualize my role within government as trying to figure out a way in which we can use its levers for the empowerment of communities so that they could be independent of the state and get still all of the things that they need to thrive and survive. I think on the build side, I'm taking to heart a theorist, Kei Wayne Yang, who's also a mentor of mine. He builds upon Donny Haraway's cyborg, and he's thinking about how we create like a different type of university. But he thinks about a cyborg as that person that takes the resources of institutions to create something else in service of decolonial futures. And I think that is in part our imperative as well, is to leverage what we can in order to build and think through the unimaginable, right? And so I think tactically, like, I still have yet to figure out like concretely what that is. I think it's like standing up programs for employee ownership at the city side, et cetera, but just wanted to note that there.
The motto of dismantle as we build, to like put that on a post-it here. I wonder if we can maybe like gently shift over into being a little bit more hopeful, like talking about what's helping us. I'm seeing some comments in the chat about like what are the healing and support practices we've found, I guess on like a very personal level, and also like in order to support each other as planners and designers.
Jumping here real quick. Let me share what's been giving me life through all of this. And I'm kind of embarrassed to say it, but I'm going to say it anyways. And it's my garden. We purchased our home 2 years ago, and I had no idea, I'm a landscape architect, how powerful land, shaping the land is, like with my hands, not just like drawing stuff. And I can't tell you how much just being in the garden and the joy that has brought me and my family has helped us cope, right, with this, and how fortunate I feel to have the opportunity to do that, right, to garden, to bring joy to my neighbors. You know, it's funny because we joke around, we're like, I think we're the epicenter of like COVID in our neighborhood, because everybody smells our roses and they stick their noses in, and I'm like, guys, we can't do this. This is like not okay anymore. So I just, there's just something so joyful, right, about enacting my identity, my love of color and vegetation in the space, right, and to share that with my community. So I think it's been gardening. It's been a podcast that I recommend all of you to listen to, which is Still Processing. It's Jenna Wortham and Wellesley Morris with the New York Times. And there's just so much sort of joy that comes out of that podcast for me that has really helped me kind of navigate these times in a way that's really productive. And Jenna has like so many tips on healing, baths, teas, all of the things that are important. So yeah, I just embarrassed to say it, but gardening, you know, as a landscape architect, I've been practicing for 8 years, and this is the first time I get it.
Don't feel badly about it. Nobody's judging you. We all still love you. For me, the one thing that's certainly been giving me hope is outside of a designer and architect, I'm also a spoken word artist and community organizer. And I've been blessed to be the founder and the co-host of an open mic here in Boston. It is the only open mic in the Boston area that happens on a monthly basis consistently and is dedicated to the LGBTQ plus communities of color. And tonight, actually, we celebrate our 11-year anniversary. And thank you, that has been my saving grace throughout everything. Undergrad, grad, working, COVID, all of the things, knowing that I have this space to go into, to be part of, to learn from, to be blessed with, has certainly kept me going. And I think more particularly here now recently, we had to pivot to a virtual open mic, which totally threw me off because I rely very much on all of my senses. And so being in a space in our, you know, quiet, dark bar areas and like being able to like smell other Black folks' hair and like feel the fabrics that they're wearing and, you know, hear folks whispering while somebody's performing on the open mic, like all of these multi-sensory experiences really contribute to the event itself. But pivoting to virtual open mics was challenging to say the least, but for me, it was a reminder of how resilient my communities are. And when I say my communities, I mean us Black folks, us queer folks, us women folk, like we will adapt and then make the most and make the best out of said adaptation. And like watching that and witnessing that happen has certainly given me a lot of hope. And it's also, in pivoting, we went from doing the mic just once a month to every single Thursday. I have no idea why in the hell I did that, y'all. That was a bad idea. Staying up till 1 a.m. every Thursday is not good. But anyways, in doing that, I realized that we were able to have more time together, this community that I'm in, and we've been talking a lot about our work because everybody's working from home and it therefore feels like we're working more than we've ever worked before. And in terms of like translating that hope into the work that we're all doing, it has been very empowering to be able to discuss the work that I'm doing outside of this space, right? And so like talking to healthcare workers, talking to other artists, talking to folks in the legal profession, there's so many different people that attend the mic, talking to educators and et cetera about the work that I'm doing, and then being able to realize how related their work is to my work, how related my work is to their work. It has certainly encouraged me to keep going and to realize that like, no, like this is good and this is gonna make a difference and this is gonna make a change, and like we need to talk more. Like I need to talk outside of my profession more often, but certainly feeling hopeful and empowered through the mic. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just feeling all of the resilience that your practices are cultivating and enlivened by it. I think I didn't mention this at the beginning, but I'm also a practitioner and teacher in politicized healing modality called generative somatics. And so I want to speak about that a little bit. And before I do that though, I kind of want to just kind of name the context that we're in, right? Right now, there's actually several mounting perils that are characterizing our time. It's the pandemic. There's nearly 9 million cases with 200,000 deaths without a clear plan of action from the federal government still. There's this monstrous regularity, right, of police murders of Black and Brown and Indigenous peoples. And the current administration isn't signaling that it intends to honor the election results and is actually withholding power, right? You know, before COVID, we were experiencing the illegitimacy of undemocratic political processes for a long time, alongside deep social divides, widening economic inequities, and the growth of carceral and policing industries, right? And I really do feel like we're in this moment where like a new world is being born, but it can't yet be because the old world still is, you know, grabbing onto its power. And, you know, before all of that too, I think for BIPOC folks in particular, right, our lineages have experienced war, imperialism, transatlantic slavery, settler colonialism, anti-queer, anti-trans sentiments and violence that have literally shaped our individual and collective bodies, right? So I think that is why, in part, this moment for BIPOC folk feels so heavy that it seems like you can't walk outside your door without feeling imminent harm. You just, it feels like the world on many different levels imploding in a sense. And I think what is poignant is that the greatest theft of oppression is that it takes away our individual and a collective ability to choose, and it impacts our ability to imagine otherwise, right? And I became intimately aware with this shaping, if you will, through my work with young people out in Oakland, California. And in trying to figure out how do we heal from all of that and how do we move forward, my body actually became a really great resource for me to ground and find something else, cultivate choice, and imagine otherwise. And I found that in part through generative somatics. And just going back to the root of what soma means, it's a Greek word, and it entails the living organism in all of its wholeness. Because of this Cartesian split, our society has really been trained to see our mind as separate from our body. And we're supposed to be these disembodied, rational folks who move through the world on a logical basis. And we just know that that's not true, right? And so I think generative somatics really builds up something different than that and integrates an understanding that we are whole people with biological, evolutionary, emotional, psychological components to us that are informed by our difference, race, gender, sexual identity, etc. And that all of that is a resource for us to catalyze and sustain embodied transformation in service of realizing our deepest longings. It's explicitly anti-racist, decolonial, and really affirming of all folks. And I think I just wanted to bring that up there because for me, it's been a powerful way in which to one, let my trauma complete. In the natural world, we evolutionarily as animals, we have the innate capacity and ability to process trauma. So for example, if you have seen videos of like a deer or something being attacked but escaping, they might run away, you know, the trauma happens, they escape, and then they might shake for a little bit, and then they kind of get up and walk away, right? Similarly with human beings, we have that ability, we cry, we tremble, you might have, you know, experienced this all yourself. But what happens when trauma happens to us, our society, our cultures, our institutions actually tell us to man up, keep it in, don't cry, you know, work in service of your white clients, even though, you know, we can't process our trauma in this timeline. And so there's a way in which our trauma actually becomes stuck in our body because the trembling, the crying cannot happen. And so we're oftentimes just moving through the world in this reactive shape, which eventually leads to our own burnout and doesn't serve us in what we long for. And so there's sometimes, it's like when you're so frustrated after reading all of these books and blogs, you're like, but I know not to be angry at my mom, she calls me. And you're like, fuck, I just like yelled at her and I didn't mean to. It's because there's a reason why, like there's this trauma that's locked in your body that doesn't allow you choice, right? So I think for me, generative somatics, there's three components: somatic awareness, somatic opening, and somatic practices, which I won't get into all here today. But it essentially has allowed me and the communities that I work with to complete that trauma so that we can come back into our bodies, into our full power, and to use our experiences and our whole life experience as a resource for liberation. And I just wanted to leave you all with one practice, because I think it can be not satisfying to learn the framework and not have a concrete action. For me, there's a way in which when I'm in my body, grounded, that I feel powerful, and people respond to my embodied leadership. And I think it's been a journey for me to understand how to get back into my body. And so I just wanted to name for you all a practice that might be helpful for you. And it's called centering. And the principle of it is to get open, present, and connected. And we do that first by really either sitting or standing, coming into an awareness of just where you're at in terms of emotions, feelings, and sensations. And then we, standing or sitting, feel into your length and draw your attention down to your feet, toward the ground, to the earth that can really hold all of you, while simultaneously feeling up along your vertebrae to the top of your head, to the spaciousness of the sky. And then we move into the dimension of width, which in this practice can signify connection and really feeling into what is there in your body. And then feeling on your backside, what is there in terms of sensations and feelings and emotions, and feeling your lineage there at your back, and then feeling into your front, all the sensations, emotions, and feelings there, and thinking about what you want to dream yourself into being into the future. And then we oftentimes bring our attention back to an organizing principle, which we call the commitment, so that you can really move from that sense of embodied centeredness to what you long for. And for me, I know how to get back into my body after doing years of that practice by feeling the nape of my neck, my shoulders, and my forearms. And there's just such a marked difference between my reactive self and my centered self that allows me to claim power for communities within this real oppressive structure of the government. So I'm happy to talk about it more. We probably have hit the time here, but I think what excites me about this moment, despite me saying all of that intense context before, is that our social movements, our design fields, our urban planners understand, really, I think more so than ever before, the need to address trauma, to deepen our healing in service of not only becoming the fullest realizations of what we always wanted to be ourselves, but also to enable and work with communities so that they too can become the fullest and highest potential of what we've always dreamed together that they could be, right?
Thank you so much, Sam. That's really beautiful. And I'm definitely guilty of seeing my body as just like an elaborate tripod that carries my brain from room to room. So it's like a really, really helpful perspective. And certainly and making me realize, even in my understanding of this phrase of practicing as whole human, really consider being present in my physical body as part of just in the last couple minutes, I want to just open it up to you all to see if there's anything else you want to add in closing. Thank you so much for creating this conversation and space together.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. This chat is so lit. It's so good.
Yeah, we don't have much time to get into things, but I'll just echo Diana's gratitude. And I saw that there were a few questions and I didn't necessarily get to read them all. So I don't know if there's a way, Elaine, for you to maybe capture them and we can post the answers to them somewhere, because I feel like people ask questions because they actually want answers. So I appreciate putting those questions out there.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe I can connect with some of the organizers to see if there's a way to share things back out. Looked like there was the questions that I saw about practices that we can have to support each other's healing and trauma. Question about, COVID sort of disrupting everything and what opportunity that has and what sort of liberation we might be able to find in the rebuilding. And then a question around, you know, in the times that we've been sort of on the edge of moving out of practice, what motivated us to stay and what helped create a path to sort of affirm our perspectives. I do think that this session will stay open a bit longer. There's like a unique link for each session. So if you three are able to stay, maybe we can continue talking about those questions. But everyone else needs a break before the next session. Thanks for joining.
Unfortunately, I can't stay. I'm still working, so I have to jump to another meeting as we talk about the demands of work.
Sure. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Jad. Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you, everybody.
Great.
Bye.
Hi.
Should we stay or leave?
Yeah, we can stay if there's looks like a few people are sticking around. Thanks. Colleen or any of the other organizers, maybe just if you could let us know if there's a way to like post questions we didn't get to answer. Maybe we could post it in like the chat for the overall event or something.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So you wanted a way to post more questions, is that correct? Or like you can post it in the event part, in like the main part. That's one way to do it. I'm free to chat with anyone who's still on here, and you can even add them into the room. I don't know if you can see that in the moderation panel.
Okay. Yeah, it's Kate.
Yes. Other than that, I think there's like other ways you can, if you want to have like a Google Doc you want to share with everyone, you can share that in the chat too. But yeah, it's up to you at this point. I think this link will stay open
That's
for a little bit longer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you both. Have a great
you.
day.
Bye.
Bye.
I guess we'll go ahead and just close this.
Okay. Bye, Elaine. Thanks so much for organizing this panel. It was awesome.
Good seeing your face.
Yeah. Bye,
Bye.
Elaine.